Welcome, friends, back to the Dolores Project. Today we have another special guest. Today I'm talking with Thomas Telving. Is that right? Am I pronouncing that right?
That is right.
Close enough? Okay. So everybody has to give me grace because I'm Southern. So, Thomas, we're glad you're here. Thomas is a philosopher, has a pedigree in philosophy, master's degree in philosophy, and has studied this subject that we're going to talk about today, which is consciousness, AI, and robotics. And so, Thomas, I'm really glad to have your perspective on the Dolores Project today. So, Thomas, before we get into the deep topic of consciousness and AI and Sophia and all these different things that you wrote about quite well in your book, I think, tell us a little bit about you, Thomas. What kind of led you into this path, and what inspired you to write about some of these topics?
Well, as you said, I have a philosophical background, and I've been working as a public relations manager, and I've been doing public affairs for a couple of companies. And then for the past 8 years, I've been self-employed and working mainly with PR and copywriting and various stuff around that. And I've also been doing SEO and social media marketing and stuff like that. And like that, I haven't been using my philosophical background, well, in a direct sense. But then about 6 or 7 years ago, I started reading books about artificial intelligence. I read Nick Bostrom's Super Intelligence, and I read Max Tegmark's Life 2.0 and some books. And that was also inspired just by, internet buzz. And actually, my interest started with a personal experience. Sophia the robot, when she started appearing on the internet, like sort of a gimmick, I guess you could say, but still also an impressive gimmick at that time, at least. And my experience with that was for me, it was kind of weird because I saw these clips with Sophia being interviewed, for various shows and stuff. And of course, I knew that Sophia was sort of an attempt to make an android, and that she's based on machine learning algorithms and all that stuff. I knew, but even though I knew quite some things about what she was, I couldn't help sort of developing some sort of feelings for her. I knew that if I disassembled her, she would look like a computer inside. But I had a feeling that she was alive, and I don't think that she is alive. But I had that feeling within me, and I couldn't really, I couldn't just decide not to have it. And that made me look into this, and I found, well, shortly thereafter that there's been written a lot about this. There's a lot of research going on in this field called human-robot interaction. So I read a lot about it, and I started writing about it as well. And this book, Killing Sophia, that I had issued spring last year in Denmark, that's inspired by that experience. And actually, it started with a piece that I wrote for a Danish newspaper about this experience, because I started thinking, well, what would happen if I was asked to do damage to this robot, And then all this about anthropomorphization and empathy, then that began. So that was sort of my way into it. And since then, a lot of things have happened, and I know now a lot about how little I knew back then when I started writing about it. But that was sort of the beginning. And then my philosophical background came in really, really handy, because I think, some of these things that we discussed in philosophy when I was studying it are really relevant to this discussion.
Yeah, I think so. I think even in the wider discussion of theology, there's this almost a membrane of, we kind of go back and forth to these questions of what does it mean to be human? What is the mind? What is the brain? And you talk quite a lot about consciousness in your book, and we'll get to that in a second. But I think that this question is so important and how we tie in and are influenced by science fiction and those large narratives of hope and fear and even now as we are seeing more discussions about ChatGPT and being that being AI chatbot and different things, people have all of these existential fears. And so that pushes a lot of us to the conversation. It sounds like it did you as well. And for me too, working with these different systems prior to philosophy, we all have some contact with it. So I think there's something in it that we either see an image of ourselves, as you're talking about with feelings, we feel connected to it, and there's this massive spectrum that we either hate it, we just have this repulsion to it, or we want to wholesale bring it in and help it assimilate into our life. And so I think it's fascinating, Tom. I really do. I think it's fascinating what we have to, I guess, deal with and integrate with, because it's here. None of us decided to make an AI model or system, and really on a lay level, on a civilian level, we don't really control what the government makes, what private companies make, and so we're really just kind of left to deal with it. So I think works like yours and others who are writing about this, it's really important for the public to understand how to frame some of these massive questions for those of us who don't have degrees in philosophy or theology and don't understand quite the depth of these metaphysical questions. And so I think that's where your book comes in, is trying to provide one answer to that. And so just tell us a little bit about Killing Sophia and what your goal was and your objectives in trying to answer some of those questions.
Yeah, and I'm glad you take it up with the public discussion, because that was actually part of my aim. Because when I started researching for this, I had a hard time finding news articles about about my experience. I later found out that there was a lot of research, but that is academic research, and from my experience, I didn't see a lot of that research out in the media, and I thought, this is going to affect us. It already is affecting us so hugely that it was important to also have a public discussion about this. I would like the public to take part in this as lay people, and I consider myself a layman in that field also. Although I have a philosophy degree, I'm not a researcher within AI or any of these things. But I think it's a really important discussion. So that's also part of what I wanted to do with my book, to sort of make a book that hopefully is accessible to people not working in this field, but should be hopefully entertaining, but also bring some light to some of these questions that normal people wouldn't ask themselves about robot, machine consciousness, and all these topics. So it started with that, and also with, I don't know if I would call it a fear, but I had this idea that if this goes like I think, then the way I reacted to Sophia, that will develop heavily over the years. So I put together sort of what I call the robot rights thesis, and I can briefly summarize that to you. It has 8 steps, but I'll try and be quick. And the first one is that starts with what we call the problem of other minds, that we have no certainty of the existence of consciousness not in humans or animals, and not in robots. In robots, we would think it is not there, but we could also be fooled into thinking that it is there. Anyway, that's called the problem of other minds. We can talk more about that later. But when we have the problem of other minds, how do we get access to other beings' consciousness? Well, we do that by empathy. And this empathic identification with others, that's also what forms the basis of morality and how we treat others. And since we empathize with beings that are similar to ourselves, then the bigger these similarities with robots will get, the stronger our empathy will become. There's also been made some great research in that. And then after that, when robots become increasingly similar, to human beings, then it'll be hard for us psychologically to exclude them from moral consideration. And then the next step is that we tend to grant some sort of rights to beings under moral consideration, and then at some point we might end up granting, well, robot rights. That's a broad concept, but a sort of right to robots that may be similar to what we talk about as human rights. That is, rights that are applied to protect technology from being harmed. That sounds crazy now, I know that, but when the technology develops, I think we'll move in that direction. So that's sort of the frame of my book, and I try to explain these different steps one by one and from different angles. So that is my project, and I am somewhat worried about that. Well, one angle is that if robots do develop a sort of consciousness, well, then I think that on that part, then we should treat them kindly. But if they don't, treating them kindly has a different perspective. There could still be moral reasons for doing that, but different moral reasons. So that's sort of that conundrum, and that's really hard because of mainly because of the problem of other minds, but also because of a lot of other things.
Yeah.
So I hope that gives sort of a picture about what my aim was with this book.
No, I think that reflects what I've read in the book and kind of how you framed some of the problems. And like you said, you talk about consciousness quite a lot. And I mean, it's heavily throughout the book. You're trying to deal with the problem of consciousness on a lay level. So I appreciated that. There's a lot of different philosophical jargon you can really get into, and that really, even for people in the field, can be for PhD students and master students, it's a lot to conceptualize. So I appreciated that about the book. And so I guess how I would describe your argument is that consciousness is kind of the necessary condition for us to consider any type of moral consideration of artificial entities. So that's something I'd like to unpack a little bit. And so my question would be to you, Thomas. Let's say that we have an alien, right? An extraterrestrial that comes from outer space. What would be the difference between us granting that entity some type of moral consideration versus, let's say, ChatGPT, or even the Bing AI, which is clearly, we understand mathematically that there's reasons for why it's making those predictions and all those things. But how would we help the layperson see the difference between those two entities? So the AI and then the ET, I guess. And if that reference makes sense anymore. So we have those two entities. How would we help the public think about granting consideration for one versus the other, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, in my opinion, consciousness is key, which is problematic, and I know that other people have other views that we can maybe get back to that, but for me, morality and ethics is a lot about it's about a lot of things, but one of the things is to keep people, animals, beings from harm. And I use pain as an example in my book a lot because that's a good example of a conscious experience. So a being that is unable to feel neither positive or negative emotions, well, it would be hard to have moral considerations for that being on behalf of the being. There could be other reasons for having moral considerations, but when we talk about rights, for me, consciousness is defining. So this is also, of course, why the problem of other minds is such a big problem in this context, because it's really hard to decide. Well, most of us think that our the people around us and animals have consciousness, of course, but when it comes to robots, well, I certainly don't think they have, but at a later level, there will be doubts about it, I think. But then back to this, the the AI model, embodied AI model here, and the space alien, what would be the difference? Well, for me, the difference would be this consciousness question, even though I know it's really hard to get into it due to this problem. Luckily, we don't have aliens here, as far as we know, so we don't have to deal with that yet. But the robots are, well, they're not only common; they are here, and they're getting more and more advanced. And this debate that I'm like to have now, that will become more and more pressing, I think. So was that an answer to your question, do you think?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, there's a lot of questions to unpack about some of your work, Thomas. And I think, one, could you help us understand from your perspective what consciousness is? I know you give a definition in the book, but could you share it with us and our listeners, Thomas, your perspective on consciousness to the best of your ability? I understand that.
Yeah, I will try, and it's I spent quite some time in the book discussing it, because it is well, the problem about defining it is that it's one of the defining characteristics is that it's subjective, so you can't put it out on the table and then look at it from each perspective and agree on what it is.
Right.
So, but defining it in the way I use the notion in this book, then I would say that this is the strictly private experiences, exemplified by colors, forms, sounds, sensations, emotions, and feelings. Running your hands over sandpaper and feeling that inside you. It's these experiences considered like independently of any impact on behavior. They're also called qualia in parts of philosophy. So that is what I mean when I talk about consciousness. I owe a lot to the Australian American philosopher David J. Chalmers, who he wrote a book about it quite some years ago, and that's what got me into it. And he splits what he calls the problem of consciousness into an easy problem of consciousness and a hard problem of consciousness. So maybe I should explain a little bit about that, because that's pretty important to this. Because, well, I've experienced when discussing this with people that they think, well, we can easily see if others have consciousness. Why is that a problem? And that is due to what Chalmers calls the easy problem of consciousness. Take the robot Sophia. She can discriminate and categorize, and she can react to environmental stimuli, and, well, she's probably even able to read if I'm tired after having slept too little. She can do all those things, and she can report information about mental states. She could say, I'm feeling sad today, so she could actually report about emotions like fear and sadness. And and she seems to have control over her behavior. She has all these signs of what we would think are consciousness. But all these things, well, if they happened in a human, you could explain them. I think a neuroscientist would be able to explain many of these things. If I burn my hand on a stove, for instance, then a neuroscientist could say that, okay, now the pain you feel in your hand, that's a warning sensation to your brain that some type of stimulus is causing damage, and you should probably do something about it. And she could explain the chains of reaction from you burn your hand as first it begins with the stimulus followed by nerve endings sending the stuff to your brains and stuff like that. All these things you can explain, but there's just one thing that you wouldn't have explained, and that's the hard problem of consciousness, because that is, it hurts. I feel pain. You can explain all these things without, if you had to explain it to a person who never felt any pain, the person would not know what you were talking about just because you explained all these physical terms.
Right.
So that is the hard problem of consciousness, and that says something about what I mean when I talk about consciousness as well, because it is this kind of consciousness that I talk about. and I am very humble about, well, how far can we get, because it has this subjective things that makes it really hard to agree upon, and that makes it a hard thing to grasp all in all. But still, when we talk about how we should treat each other, it's the important thing, as I see it.
Yeah. And I think too, just kind of let people understand how difficult it is to describe the feeling of pain, like the actual phenomenon of pain is when you go to the doctor, they ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, depicted by these images, what level of pain are you in? And so one part of that's, medical ethics is, well, if someone says they're a 10, we have to give them some type of painkiller, right? Because it's immoral just to not treat that person's pain. But they could be lying about that pain. There's no way to physically test the internal state. Like what you're saying is, we are describing first person subjective feelings, and we're not able to test them subjectively or empirically, rather, from the outside perspective. So, I mean, it's difficult. It's, if not impossible, I think, to ever really say what it's like to be, or what the aboutness of what it's like to be Sophia, or what it's like to be an AI. And so we have different perspective, Thomas, and I don't want to just not debate or anything. I just, we come to it from different viewpoints. And so for me as a theologian, I'm open to the fact that there might be the possibility of an emergence for an AI to have a self, to use an old word, to be ensouled. And so I think that you use soul language a little bit in Killing Sophia, so that kind of perked up my theological antenna. Do you believe in the concept of the soul? Do you believe are you a materialist or anything like that? So could you unpack that for me? I think that's really important in this debate too, is how far we're willing to take that line of thought depends really on what we believe about the soul.
That's a really good question. I also mentioned Descartes in the book, because he did a lot for this discussion. Some think he did a lot of bad, but he framed it, and we can't discuss that. So where am I? I mean, I have a really hard time saying where am I, because I think it's so hard, such hard questions. But first of all, I would never exclude the possibility of an AI model becoming sentient at some stage.
Mm-hmm.
I would find it very, very odd if the large language models like OpenAI's ChatGPT that are being discussed now, if they were sentient or conscious, that would, I think that wouldn't make much sense. There's more things to say about it, but perhaps I could touch upon a little this first, because a large language model, which is sort of the way we also would interact with a humanoid robot, well, that is trained on human language. So all the expressions that it uses, if it talks about emotions, well, then it actually talks about human emotions, because it is our language. And our language is very much based on evolution, and it's very much based on our senses. And since a large language model never had anything to do with these senses, well, if it uses the words, how on earth could it get an understanding of these words? It simply doesn't make sense from my point of view. But that is not the same as to say that it might not, at some later development of a different approach to artificial intelligence, will become relevant. Then it, I mean, I would never exclude that. So I'm not trying to claim that this can never happen. I would never go so far. Okay, so that's just to be clear about that. But then these things about materialism and dualism and all these stances that are in the philosophical discussion about consciousness. Well, I don't think there is any satisfactory theory just yet on this, and I don't think that many researchers or philosophers think there are. There are good approaches, good attempts. David Chalmers did some interesting stuff, and well, but I don't agree with him. And a lot of people did very good stuff, but I don't think they sort of cracked it yet.
Right.
But I can say that I do think that the mind has that the mind is part of the brain, so to speak.
Okay.
So I don't think that the mind. When I speak about Descartes, I use the word soul because that's what was used at
Right.
his time. So talking about a soul, we have this thing that this soul can live without the body. And as I think I told you, I'm not particularly religious, so I don't believe that. I think it's a nice thought, but I don't believe it myself. And so I don't see that the mind could be disconnected from the body, taking the body also as our brains. But on the other hand, I don't think that the mind can be explained by the same concepts that we use for explaining physical stuff. And that's part of why it is so hard to make a science about it, because it's different, because we can't give it the full explanation without using physical metaphors. My pain can be burning. Yes, well, burning like what, a fire? Yeah. Or my pain can be sort of like have a cutting feel. These different. So you mentioned this pain spectrum before, used in medicine. There's also some categories used to describe pain, the quality of pain, not only the size of the pain, but also the quality. But these are all physical metaphors. They are not directly describing the pain itself, because that's not possible, because it's subjective. So that's what makes it so hard, and what makes it so fascinating, and sometimes frustrating. And when it comes to robots and artificial intelligence, that becomes, or it will become, a real problem when people really start to empathize with robots. And then it's a natural thing to think they are alive, like Blake Lemoine, the Blake Lemoine story, which I guess most people know now, at least in this field. Well, it seemed so human, this conversation he had with LaMDA, that he thought it was alive. And that's a little bit like the experience I had with seeing these Sophia video clips, that because he's Blake Lemoine, he's a clever guy. I mean, and he knows a lot about this stuff, but it doesn't help him. He still thinks it's alive. I don't, but I can certainly see why he does, because that's a natural human reaction to human-like technology. We anthropomorphize and we empathize, and those two things are good. But when it comes to technology, I see them as potentially problematic.
Yeah. Well, I think I like Sven Nieholm's thoughts on this. He said in his book Humans and Robots that this anthropomorphism that we have as we look at objects and entities, it's not really a bug. And I thought that was so profound, even for my own philosophy, because when we think about people who can't empathize, that's a problem in our society, right? We think about sociopaths. We think about people who can't possibly imagine what it would be like to hurt, and in some ways we can make that argument for robots, that they would be sociopaths because they will not understand what the phenomena is, of what it's like to be a human. But we also have humans like that. And so I think that's a fascinating tension that we have to deal with is, okay, we're going to project these ideas onto the robot, onto the entity. We just know that that's actually a good sign that the human mind is functioning properly. And I would say, according to its design, that we're not made to harm one another we're made to be a part of a larger story and scaffolding within the ecosystem of persons, and that's relation to the environment, that's relation to animals, and obviously I believe that falls under an umbrella of deity, of God, for me in my own personal confession. So I think that's how the system is supposed to work, but we have these responses, just innate responses to technology, even though we can't separate it from the ecological. It is a part of the environment. And so for me, and it took me a long time to get there, Tom, it wasn't like an overnight thing. It took me a while to get there that, okay, if I'm going to consider something morally consideration for, let's say, LaMDA or Sophia, it's really not so much about the object for me. And I think that's what you're saying as well, is it's not about the object. It's not what's happening inside the system. It's not about the model per se, but it's about how that influences me as an operator, as a human entity. And of course, we feel empathy, like you said earlier, about to our pets. To definitely, people feel concerned about their iPhones, their technology. We have language about babying our phone or babying our, and it's because it costs a lot of money, right? It's a valuable resource, not inherent to the actual device. But I think there's still something to that as we think about, just going back to your book, would we hurt or kill Sophia? Should we? And how does that all flesh out? And so I guess, Thomas, my question is, would you make a concession kind of consistent with what we see in the legal rights conversation towards nature and certain animals, where it's not so much about whether the river, the tree, the elephant is conscious or not, but that it has some type of societal benefit to protect this entity? So what would it take for you to kind of cross that threshold? And
I've been spending quite a lot of time with the works of David J. Gunkel and also Josh Gellers that you also had in your show here, and their thoughts, because they have a broader view on this than I have, and I have been very inspired by their thoughts, but I don't know. I don't know if I will someday agree with them. I don't think so. I think Josh Gellers, for listeners who don't know him, he, as I read him, he's a proponent for using rights for nature, but also perhaps at some stage or in some instances for robotics in some kinds of robots. That would take more explanation, but just broadly meant. And I can definitely see, and David J. Gunkel, which I also mentioned, has this idea that what the important thing is the relation. It's not the properties we carry. It's the relations between us that are the important thing. And I wouldn't say that. First of all, I have huge respect for both of those, but I have a narrower understanding, and I think that if we come to this, I would say that you have to choose, you have to prioritize between two. Well, I don't know what you call it, a robot and a person, and they are identical to look at. Then I say, okay, chop off one of their fingers. Which of those would you see it as the biggest moral problem, chopping off the finger? The one having a consciousness or the one not having a consciousness? Well, then I would say, okay, definitely the one feeling the pain instead of just the one, being able to simulate feeling the pain. So you see that difference. For me, that is key, and that is why I think consciousness is important. And I would hate to see a situation, that would be in the far future, of course, where we had like this Westworld scenario. I know we should be, a little bit not use too many sci-fi examples, but let's do it for the case of the argument.
Mm.
But if you come to such a situation, and then we prioritize a robot that has nothing going on a mental level over a human being that is able to feel pain and sadness and happiness and joy, that would be a bad situation.
Mm.
Max Tegmark writes in his
Mm.
book Life 2.0 that if we have this huge robotic development in the future, and I wouldn't call it a robotic takeover, but just more and more, maybe on behalf instead of humans. Well, and he calls that the great zombie robot apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine just a whole lot of nothing going on, really, because there's a lot going on, but there's no one experiencing it because these
Mm.
machines don't experience anything. I don't see that as a very good scenario.
Mm.
So that's why I'm so obsessed, some would say, with consciousness. But that being said, when I also have sympathy for this David J. Gunkel approach, looking at what goes on with our relations and all that, that is because, well, first of all, if we do have a relation with a robot, and we have the problem of other minds, and it's impossible to break that problem, well, then maybe it's a realistic approach to saying, how should we treat these entities? They behave like us, they talk like us. I mean, can we just treat them
Mm.
poorly without any consideration? That doesn't sound right either. So maybe we just, well, maybe that is where we are gonna, in a far future, it's gonna end. I'm speculating, of course, but so I can see that point, but I would go a far way to. I really hope that the scientific research in consciousness, takes some leaps, so to break the problem of other minds.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that fiction is a problem to talk about, and I think it really helps frame sometimes for people because they don't have either the philosophical background to conceptualize it. So I'm all for bringing that into the conversation. And I think one of my favorite, as far as the ethical spectrum of the conversation, one of my favorite stories is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I think there's a lot more conversation needs to happen, based on what you're talking about with empathy and consciousness and moral relations, where we need to think about not only what will result from this creation, but do we even personally have the right to create something that would potentially have these things? And of course, there's a big stance in the Catholic Church about, and they've been thinking about these things at least since the 50s. If people are interested, and there's lots of great scholars out there. But there's a lot to consider, even with, should we make life? Should we think about the guy's name, Robin Cook? That's his name. He wrote a book that was a remix of Frankenstein, where this kid is a super genius, and he starts making copies of himself to create this very Nazi-like society where he's, using eugenics and different things to make copies of himself and the perfect society. And so I think sometimes we forget to look back on what was happening in the 18th, 19th century, 20th century, and these desires to make and transcend the limits of life. And now we're in a moment where it's not unthinkable or uncommon to see an ad on Instagram, discussions on Twitter about using AI to help you be more productive, or using this to make you enhanced, or using certain pharmaceuticals. And think about stem cell research. I think about male pattern baldness. I think, just all these different things where there's questionable morals and ethics in place, but we kind of put that aside so that we can get to either transcendence or the whole robotics conversation kind of stems around this idea of immortality and the uploading of the brain, which I just find so far-fetched based on my own metaphysics. But I understand why we would ask that question and why we'd want to do that, and how we see the brain as data and all those different analogies. But that's what they are to me, Thomas. They are metaphors and analogies. They're not based on biological science, empirical science, and definitely not based on metaphysics. So I think that's an important part of the conversation too. And I appreciate in your book, Killing Sophia, that you try to kind of get to that a little bit quicker. It's a short book, right? So if the audience is interested, definitely go check it out. And it's in English. I know that you're originally a writer in Danish, but it's in English if people are concerned about that. And it's definitely worth looking into as far as trying to deal with consciousness on a lay level. And so I appreciate that, Thomas, and I really do appreciate your time. And if there's anything you'd like to share with our audience about stuff that you're working on now, anything that you'd like to promote, where can people find you and those type of things, please share with us.
Yeah. Well, I'm on, I have an idea for a book, but I'm going to wait a little bit with that because I only started taking notes. But otherwise, I write for a page in English called dataethics.eu, and I put out about an article a month. Last I wrote about ChatGPT and OpenAI. One thing that takes up my mind right now is actually the introduction of these conversational systems that I think was pretty clumsy. And I think that sometimes we get too excited about new tech and we forget to ask more fundamental questions, which could be, does this technology make any person on earth happier or a better person? Does this make a better life for someone? Does this make a better society? These questions, we don't seem to ask them. We just think, oh, the technology is coming. There's nothing we can do about it. So now we just have to adopt it all we can. I think that's a problem and probably a little bit naive to try to fight it, but I will still try to at least make people think that maybe we could ourselves affect what kind of technology we have, and maybe we could be better at using good technology for good things, and maybe just leaving some technology behind because we could say, well, this is actually not really a very good technology for us people, which is an option, but we don't seem to consider that. So that's what that takes up my mind a lot right now. And as for your second question, I'm on Twitter, not that often, but I use it now and then at Thomas Telving. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. So just these challenges. I try to stay away from social media a bit because it's very time consuming. But I understand. But I find a lot of inspiration because there are a lot of researchers on Twitter sharing new articles and stuff. So it's also a good place to keep up. Try to keep up. It's
absolutely
a huge body of research. You can't read it all, but yeah.
It's deep. It's deep. Well, Thomas, thank you so much for being with us today on the Dolores Project. We're grateful for you. And I will link all those things in the description below and in the video segment of this as well. So make sure if you have questions for Thomas, reach out to him. I've really enjoyed our interactions and conversations over the last year. And so thanks, man, for being on. And we'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me.